I've worked with wildlife for 25 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. At 47, running a small wildlife rehabilitation center from my property in the Colorado Rockies, I'd treated injured eagles, orphaned bear cubs, and countless smaller creatures. I knew the rules backward and forward. Minimize human contact. Never treat wild animals as pets. Always prioritize their return to natural behavior. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened that cold October night. I was asleep when the sound woke me around 2 a.m. A desperate, high-pitched mewing that cut through the silence of the mountain night. Living this far from civilization, unusual animal sounds weren't uncommon, but something about this cry was different, urgent, frightened. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, stepping onto the porch of my cabin. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath created small clouds in the freezing air. The mewing came again, closer now, from near the tree line about 30 yards from my cabin. I approached cautiously, knowing that predators often use distress calls to lure prey, and mountain lions were common in this area. What I found in the beam of my flashlight made my heart clench. A bobcat cub, probably only 8 or 10 weeks old, sat huddled against a fallen log. Even from a distance, I could see he was in trouble. His fur was matted with what looked like blood. One of his front paws was held at an awkward angle, and he was shivering violently in the cold. The cub saw me and cried out again, but he didn't run. That alone told me how desperate his situation was. Healthy wild bobcats, even young ones, typically fled from humans. I stood still, assessing the situation, with the practiced eye of someone who'd made countless similar decisions. The cub was too young to survive alone, clearly injured, and showing signs of hypothermia. If his mother was nearby, she would have come to his cries by now. Something had happened to separate them, and this little one wouldn't survive the night without intervention. I approached slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice I'd learned wild animals responded to best. The cub watched me with those distinctive amber eyes, his pupils dilated with fear and pain. But he didn't attempt to flee or attack. When I got close enough, I saw the problem. His left front paw was caught in what looked like abandoned fishing line, the nylon cutting deep into the skin. He'd clearly been struggling to free himself for hours, maybe longer. I pulled off my jacket and carefully wrapped it around the cub, feeling his tiny body trembling against my hands. He made a small sound of protest but didn't struggle as I gently lifted him. The fact that he allowed this handling told me how weak and desperate he was. Back at the cabin, I brought him into my rehabilitation room, a converted garage equipped for exactly these situations. Under proper lighting, I could assess his injuries more thoroughly. The fishing line had cut deep, and the paw was swollen and infected. There were also scratches along his side, possibly from trying to escape whatever situation had trapped him. I'd need to clean the wounds, administer antibiotics, and keep him warm while his small body fought off the infection. As I worked, the cub watched me with unblinking attention, as if trying to understand what was happening. Treating the injuries took nearly 2 hours. I had to carefully cut away the fishing line, clean the infected wound, apply antibiotic ointment, and wrap the paw in a light bandage that wouldn't restrict his movement too much. The cub endured the process with remarkable stoicism, only crying out when I had to clean the deepest part of the wound. Throughout the procedure, I talked to him in that same calm voice, explaining what I was doing even though I knew he couldn't understand the words. But tone matters to animals, and keeping my voice steady seemed to comfort him. When the medical care was complete, I faced another decision: what to do with him for the rest of the night. Ideally, I'd release him back where I'd found him, hoping his mother would locate him. But in his weakened state, hypothermic and injured, he wouldn't survive until morning. I prepared a small heated enclosure in my rehabilitation room, lining it with soft blankets and placing a warm water bottle wrapped in towels inside. The cub needed food, but I had to be careful. Feeding wildlife the wrong things could cause serious digestive problems. I prepared a mixture of raw meat and a special formula I kept for carnivorous mammals, offering it in a shallow dish. The cub ate ravenously, confirming he'd been without food for many hours. After eating, he curled up on the warm blankets, his tiny body finally relaxing as the heat seeped into him. I watched him for a while. This small, wild creature who'd stumbled into my life. His spotted coat was beautiful, even matted with dirt. His oversized paws promising he'd grow into a formidable predator if he survived to adulthood. I knew what I had to do. Give him tonight to recover, then release him at dawn near where I'd found him. I barely slept that night, checking on the cub every hour to ensure he was stable. Each time I entered the rehabilitation room, he'd lift his head and watch me with those intelligent eyes, making small chirping sounds that bobcats use to communicate. By morning, his condition had improved significantly. The shivering had stopped, his eyes were brighter, and when I checked his injured paw, the swelling had already started to decrease. The antibiotics were working. After a light breakfast of more meat mixture, I made the decision to release him. I'd marked the GPS coordinates where I'd found him, and I carried him back to that spot in a ventilated carrier. The morning was beautiful. Crisp autumn air, golden sunlight filtering through the pines, the kind of perfect Colorado day that reminded me why I'd chosen this isolated life. I opened the carrier near the fallen log where I'd found the cub. He emerged cautiously, sniffing the air, clearly recognizing the area. I'd removed the bandage from his paw. It would only hinder him in the wild. And the wound, while still healing, was clean and properly treated. The cub looked back at me once, and I could have sworn there was recognition in that gaze, some acknowledgement of what had passed between us. Then he turned and disappeared into the underbrush, with the fluid grace that came naturally to his species. I watched the spot where he'd vanished for a long moment, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that came with every successful release. I'd helped him survive, given him a chance to find his mother, or learn to fend for himself. That was my job, my calling. I walked back to my cabin, already mentally preparing for my scheduled tasks. There were 2 injured ravens in my care, and a red fox with a broken leg that needed daily physical therapy. The rest of that day passed normally, filled with the routine work of caring for the other animals in my rehabilitation. I fed the ravens, changed the fox's bandages, cleaned enclosures, and caught up on paperwork for the Wildlife Service. The Bobcat Cub remained in my thoughts, but I'd learned long ago not to get emotionally attached to the animals I helped. Attachment compromised judgment and made the necessary work of rehabilitation harder. That evening, I was in my kitchen preparing dinner when I heard a sound on my porch. A soft thump followed by familiar chirping. My heart rate immediately increased. I moved to the window and peered out into the dusk. There, sitting on my porch steps with something in his mouth, was the Bobcat Cub. He'd returned. My first thought was that something was wrong, that he was sick or injured again. But as I opened the door, I saw that he looked healthy, alert, his injured paw bearing weight properly. He dropped what he'd been carrying, a freshly killed rabbit still warm, and looked up at me with what I could only describe as expectant pride. I stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. The cub chirped again, then nudged the rabbit toward me with his nose before sitting back on his haunches. The behavior was unmistakable to anyone who'd studied feline behavior. He was bringing me a gift. Specifically, he was bringing me prey, the way a mother cat teaches her kittens to hunt, or the way cats sometimes bring gifts to humans they view as family. This tiny wild bobcat, released only hours ago, had returned to my cabin and brought me food. The implications were staggering and went against everything I knew about appropriate wildlife rehabilitation. Wild animals weren't supposed to seek out humans, weren't supposed to form these kinds of attachments. I should have scared him away immediately, should have made loud noises and aggressive gestures to reestablish the appropriate fear of humans that would keep him safe in the wild. That was protocol. That was proper rehabilitation practice. But looking at this small creature who'd traveled back through the forest to bring me a gift, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I sat down on the porch steps, maintaining a respectful distance, and spoke to him in that same calm voice from the night before. I thanked him for the gift, explained that I couldn't accept it, that he needed to keep it for himself. As if he understood, the cub picked up the rabbit again and began eating, right there on my porch, occasionally looking up at me between bites. When he finished, he groomed himself thoroughly, then simply curled up on the corner of my porch and went to sleep. I sat there for over an hour, watching him, my mind racing through the ethical implications of this situation. Every training I'd received said I should force him to leave, should break this attachment before it became dangerous for him. Human-habituated wildlife rarely survived long. They lost their fear, approached the wrong people, and often ended up destroyed as nuisance animals. But there was something different about this interaction. The cub wasn't acting tame or dependent. He'd hunted successfully, brought me prey to share, then settled in a spot where he could rest safely. This wasn't learned helplessness. This was a wild animal who'd made a choice about where to be. As darkness fell, the cub woke, stretched with the fluid grace of all felines, and looked at me one more time before disappearing into the forest. I sat on the porch long after he'd gone, trying to understand what was happening and what I should do about it. The next morning, the cub returned at dawn. This time he brought no gift, just appeared on my porch and sat watching the door until I emerged. When I did, he chirped in greeting, then proceeded to groom himself while I prepared food for my other rehabilitation animals. He didn't beg for food or try to enter my cabin. He simply existed in my space, as if he'd decided my porch was now part of his territory. This pattern continued for the next week. The cub, I'd started calling him Scout in my mind, though I knew I shouldn't name him, would appear each morning and evening, sometimes bringing prey, sometimes just visiting. He'd spend an hour or two on or near my porch, often sleeping in the sun, before disappearing back into the forest. I documented everything in detailed notes, knowing this was unusual behavior that wildlife biologists would want to study. I also called my supervisor at the Wildlife Service, explaining the situation and asking for guidance. Her response was predictable. I needed to discourage the visits, needed to break the pattern before it became dangerous. But when I tried, Scout simply moved to just beyond my property line and watched from there. The moment I went back inside, he'd returned to the porch. It became clear that short of trapping and relocating him, which would be traumatic and potentially deadly given his age, I couldn't force him to leave. So I made a decision that probably violated every rehabilitation guideline but felt ethically right. I would allow the visits, but maintain boundaries. No feeding from my hand, no encouraging dependency, no treating him as a pet. Scout seemed to accept these boundaries instinctively. He never tried to enter my cabin, never begged for food, never acted domesticated. As weeks passed, I witnessed Scout's development from cub to juvenile bobcat. His injured paw healed completely with no lingering limp. He grew larger, his hunting skills becoming more sophisticated. I'd watch from my window as he stalked birds in my yard, practiced pouncing on shadows, climbed trees with increasing confidence. He was learning all the skills a wild bobcat needed, but he was doing it while maintaining his connection to my property. I researched extensively, reading everything I could find about bobcat behavior, territory establishment, and human-wildlife interactions. What I learned fascinated me. Bobcats, while typically solitary, do maintain complex social relationships. Young bobcats sometimes remain near their mother's territory for months after independence, gradually expanding their own range. Some studies suggested that bobcats could form positive associations with specific humans, particularly if that human had helped them during a vulnerable period. Scout might be viewing my property as a safe zone within his expanding territory, and me as a non-threatening presence associated with safety and healing. This realization shifted my perspective. I wasn't creating a dependent, tame animal. Scout was still entirely wild, still hunting and surviving on his own. I was simply a reference point in his territory, perhaps serving a similar role to what his mother would have if she'd survived. The other wildlife I was rehabilitating seemed unbothered by Scout's presence. The ravens ignored him, and the fox, now recovered enough for release, showed only natural wariness. Scout, for his part, showed no interest in my rehabilitation animals, somehow understanding they were off limits. One evening, I was sitting on my porch reading, when Scout appeared with something unexpected in his mouth. Not prey, but a large pine cone. Scout dropped the pine cone at my feet, then batted it with his paw, looking at me expectantly. It took me a moment to understand what he was doing. He was playing, inviting me to engage in the kind of play that young predators use to develop hunting skills. I'd seen domestic cats do similar things, but witnessing it in a wild bobcat was extraordinary. I picked up a small stick and tossed it near him, not at him, keeping the interaction low-key. Scout pounced on it immediately, wrestling the stick with his front paws, while his hind legs kicked in the characteristic predator move that would disembowel prey. After killing the stick, he picked it up and brought it back, dropping it near me before crouching in anticipation of another throw. We played like this for perhaps 10 minutes before Scout suddenly froze, his attention locked on something in the forest. In an instant, he was gone, disappearing into the darkening woods with the speed and silence that made bobcats such effective predators. I was left sitting on my porch with a stick in my hand, marveling at what had just occurred. This wild animal had initiated play with me, had sought out social interaction not because he needed food or help, but apparently because he wanted company. I documented this incident extensively, knowing it represented something significant about animal cognition and emotional capacity. Over the following months, Scout's visits became less frequent as his territory expanded. Sometimes a week would pass without seeing him, and I'd wonder if he'd finally moved on completely. But then he'd reappear, larger and more confident each time, often with evidence of successful hunts. A full belly, occasionally blood on his muzzle, the satisfied look of a predator who'd eaten well. I celebrated these absences as signs of his successful transition to full wildness, even as I missed his presence. Winter arrived in full force, bringing heavy snow and temperatures well below freezing. I worried about Scout during the worst storms, but I knew that bobcats were well adapted to harsh winters, and my worry was more emotional attachment than rational concern. Then, during the worst blizzard of the season, Scout appeared on my porch looking bedraggled and cold. The snow was coming down so heavily that visibility was only a few feet, and the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. For the first time since his initial rescue, Scout actually scratched at my door, a behavior I'd never seen from him before. I faced a difficult decision. Bringing him inside would reinforce exactly the kind of dependency I'd been trying to avoid. But leaving him out in this storm could be fatal. Even wildlife adapted to cold has limits. I compromised by opening my heated garage, the same rehabilitation room where I'd first treated him. Scout entered cautiously, shook the snow from his coat, and immediately found a corner where he could see both the door and the windows. He didn't approach me, didn't act tame or needy. He simply took shelter, as any intelligent animal would. I left food and water accessible, then returned to the main cabin, giving him space and privacy. Through the garage window, I periodically checked on him. Scout slept through most of the storm, occasionally waking to eat or use the litter box I'd optimistically provided. He never tried to enter the main cabin, never scratched at the connecting door. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, I opened the garage door to a transformed landscape of deep snow and brilliant sunshine. Scout emerged, stretched luxuriously, then looked at me with what I interpreted as acknowledgement, before bounding off into the snow-covered forest. Spring brought unexpected developments. Scout, now nearly full-grown and magnificent with his spotted coat and powerful build, appeared one morning with a companion, a female bobcat, slightly smaller and more skittish. He brought her to the edge of my property, staying between her and my cabin in what looked like protective positioning. I watched from the window, not wanting to spook the female, as Scout seemed to be showing her his territory. Over several days, I observed Scout with this female, recognizing mating behavior. He'd found a partner, was establishing his own territory that apparently still included my property as a safe zone. The female never approached the cabin, maintaining appropriate wild wariness of humans. but she clearly accepted Scout's association with this place. I felt an unexpected surge of pride. Scout had successfully transitioned to full adult wild behavior while maintaining his unique relationship with me. Months later, Scout brought his family to show me. 3 tiny cubs, miniature versions of himself, peeking out from behind their mother's legs at the strange bipedal creature their father seemed comfortable around. Scout sat proudly as I watched from the porch, not approaching, but clearly demonstrating to his mate and cubs that this territory was safe. The female still maintained her distance, teaching her cubs appropriate caution around humans, but Scout's confidence seemed to reassure them. I documented this extraordinary behavior, sending reports to wildlife biologists who were fascinated by this case study of a successfully rehabilitated wild bobcat maintaining positive human association while living entirely wild and reproducing successfully. It challenged assumptions about wildlife rehabilitation and suggested that the relationship between humans and wild animals could be more nuanced than simple categories of wild or tame allowed for. Years passed, and Scout's visits became less frequent, but never stopped entirely. I'd see him occasionally, always from a distance now, often with different mates as bobcats are not monogamous. Sometimes I'd find evidence of his presence, tracks in the snow, scat marking territory boundaries, or the remains of prey cached near my property line. Each sign felt like a message. I'm here, I remember, I'm thriving. I aged from my late 40s into my 50s, my hair graying, my movements slightly slower. Scout aged too, his muzzle showing white, his movements perhaps not quite as explosive as in youth. But when our paths crossed, there was always that moment of recognition, a pause, eye contact, acknowledgement of our shared history. One autumn morning, almost exactly 10 years after our first meeting, I found Scout on my porch one last time. He was thin, clearly elderly by bobcat standards, his coat no longer glossy. He didn't bring prey or seek play. He simply came to rest in the sunny spot he'd favored as a cub. I sat with him, not touching but present, while he slept in the warm afternoon light. When he woke, he looked at me with those same amber eyes, now clouded slightly with age. Then he stood, stretched, and walked slowly into the forest. It was the last time I saw him alive. 3 days later, I found his body near the fallen log where we'd first met. He'd returned to that spot, coming full circle, choosing to end his life in the territory that had defined so much of it. I buried him there, marking the spot with a simple stone, and allowed myself to grieve for this wild creature who'd taught me so much about the capacity for connection across species boundaries. Scout's legacy continued long after his death. His offspring and their offspring populated the territory around my property, and while none formed quite the same relationship I'd had with Scout, they showed less fear of me than typical wild bobcats. I'd see them occasionally, a flash of spotted fur in the trees, eyes watching from the underbrush, tracks crossing my property. Each sighting reminded me of the extraordinary gift Scout had given me. The wildlife rehabilitation community remained divided about my experience with Scout. Some saw it as a dangerous precedent that could encourage inappropriate interactions with wildlife. Others recognized it as valuable documentation of complex animal cognition and emotional capacity. I understood both perspectives. What I did with Scout wouldn't be appropriate for every animal or every situation, but I also knew that rigid adherence to rules without consideration of individual circumstances could mean missing opportunities for deeper understanding. Looking back on those 10 years with Scout, I don't regret the choices I made. Yes, I may have bent rehabilitation guidelines, may have allowed an attachment that protocols would discourage, but I also witnessed something remarkable: a wild animal making autonomous choices about relationship and territory, a creature typically described as solitary, demonstrating complex social behavior, and what appeared to be gratitude, affection, and trust. Scout taught me that wildness isn't diminished by positive association with humans, that animals have far more complex emotional lives than we often credit them with, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones that don't fit neatly into established categories. My work continues, and I still maintain strict boundaries with most of the wildlife I rehabilitate. But I also watch for those rare individuals who, like Scout, seem to be offering something beyond the typical human-wildlife interaction, a relationship based on mutual respect, appropriate boundaries, and recognition of our shared existence on this complicated, beautiful planet. That's the real gift Scout gave me. Not just his presence, but the understanding that the wild world and the human world don't have to be completely separate, that connection and respect can coexist, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply allowing another being to make their own choices about where they belong.